Test on 3. Okay, wow, a little hot. Are you, okay, that's better. I got the high sign that we're going to talk, that the session started. So we are on another session of History and Polity of the UCC. Tonight we are going to cover 3 movements. I was going to get to 4, but when I got it together, I was putting it together this afternoon. I'm thinking, if I go with a 4, I will be well over my allotted hour. And people will be getting up to leave. You always want them leaving wanting more rather than, will you please stop? Okay, so we're going to start off with one of the movements, which was kind of an outgrowth of the Reform movement, the Anabaptists. And the Anabaptists developed out of a group of people who thought they agreed with Luther and Zwingli on a lot of things, with the break with the church, with especially with Luther and Zwingli's teaching that the church should get back to its basics, should reflect the Christianity that you find in the Gospels. That both Luther and Zwingli especially, since Zwingli was even more of a scholar of the Bible than Luther was, said we should be strict adherents to the way the Gospel described the rules. The way that Jesus is presented, or the way of Jesus presented in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. And there's a group of people that thought that Luther and Zwingli didn't go far enough, that if they followed it to the logical conclusion, there would be some more things done. That both Luther and Zwingli were not willing to go that far. And one of them was that they, one of the beliefs, and this was hence their name, was that Anabaptists did not believe in infant baptism. And the reason why is that they believed that one of the ways that they believed Zwingli and Luther didn't go far enough is the separation between the church and the society that surrounded it. They believed that the church should be separate, that the society was compromising. The society that surrounded was a compromising element that took away from the purity of the gospel and the strength of one's faith. So their problem with infant baptism then was that there was no personal choice involved, and they said that when you baptize someone as an infant, then they're essentially a part of the church merely for the fact of their being born. That there was no decision there, and therefore no commitment, and therefore no separation from the society. So they believed in adult baptism. or baptism that takes place once a person can make the conscious choice to separate from society, to be a part of the church, and separate from those compromising elements of the society. Their basic tenet, the basic tenet of Anabaptists, is that the central element of their theology was the Sermon on the Mount. Which was the core of Jesus' teaching. If there was a theology of Jesus, there wasn't, but if there was a theology of Jesus, the core of it would be the Sermon on the Mount. I had the senior minister at the church I served in California. He did a whole series of sermons on the Sermon on the Mount, because he says if we as Christians can understand the Sermon on the Mount, we can understand all of Jesus' ministry. I, just being me, have to be argumentative and say, oh, it's a little bit more complicated than that, Carl. And he gave me one of those looks. So along with this being one of the tenets, the other major tenet was pacifism. They believed that if you strictly adhered to the Sermon on the Mount, especially in the Beatitude, blessed are the peacemakers, that there is no way as a Christian you could be involved in any sort of armed conflict at all. Necessarily, they would have some problems with Zwingli, who at one point in his career, even after he became a priest, was a mercenary in the army. So, the problem they ran into as Anabaptists is that, one, they were wanting to separate, believed in the separation of the church from society. Therefore, the church was supposed to have nothing to do and not dependent at all from society, and to take no funds from society. They run afoul of the Catholics, right? And they had problems with the Protestants, or at least the Reformers, because they wanted to reform the Reformers. So they were kind of stuck out there by themselves, and the Catholic Church actually believed them to be subversive. And there were some, they took, at first it was just mere detractors. People kind of thought that they were just this weird group, and they called them Anabaptizers or re-baptizers, which isn't accurate, because they didn't believe in baptizing again, because they believed infant baptism was illegitimate and what didn't count. So they were adult baptizers, not re-baptizers. You see the difference? But they didn't see that baptism as legitimate. So in their minds, they weren't re-baptizing, they were baptizing correctly. That's the difference. That was the difference between how they held their position and their detractors saw them. But anyway, Anabaptists stuck. Okay. What Dayton pointed out was that the Anabaptists were baptized in the Catholic Church. And that's true. They were baptized in the Catholic Church, but in their belief system, that baptism wasn't legitimate. The beginning event was when it officially kind of got started was when in 1525, when Conrad Grebel baptized George Blaurock. That was the start of the Anabaptist movement. Now, what started as kind of simple detractors or criticism became much more serious. It became active persecution to the point of the Diet of Spire, or how do you pronounce this? Not diet, it's diet. Diet of Spire. The Diet of Spire was held, and what they did was first, what was interesting about this diet was it was the first time that those who had kind of broken away from the church, the early Protestants, were actually called Protestants. Okay? They were actually, the term Protestant actually came up in this diet, right? Which was held by the Catholic Church. And the second thing, a more major thing that affected this movement was that there was a decree that was established during this diet that said anybody who followed this movement were guilty of not only heresy, but of sedition. That they not only went against the tenets of the church and committed heresy, which itself was punishable by death, but that they were also working against the government. They were doing acts of sedition. So that diet set forth a series, a spate of persecution that essentially drove them out of Switzerland and Germany and in different places, even as far away as Russia. So that was the Anabaptist movement. Now, one of the tenets, like I said, of Anabaptism was pacifism, with an exception. There were some revolutionary Anabaptists, especially once the persecution started, right? When somebody starts threatening your life and killing you because you believe in a particular belief system, you have a tendency to react in the same way that they attack you, right? So what happened, and there was a couple, there was a couple of leaders. One was Melchior Hoffman. And he went around and he started preaching that the day of judgment, or the day of the Lord, was near. And since it was near, his preaching, since he was preaching it was near, a lot of his followers said, okay, the day of the judgment is near, the day of the Lord is near, we need to arm ourselves in order to be prepared for this day. So they started arming themselves, they started reacting. It came to a head when two people, John Matthews and his disciple John of Lighter, led a group of people. They conspired together and they led a group of people and took over Munster, the town of Munster. And they renamed it New Jerusalem. They just took it over, declared it to be New Jerusalem, formed a new government, and they expelled Catholics and moderate Protestants, or essentially anybody who didn't believe in their point of view. They also destroyed anything that would be too much of the world. They destroyed paintings, they destroyed sculptures, they destroyed any item of worship that they thought was too gaudy. Just destroyed them. And they held out for a while. But eventually they were defeated. And the violent and Anabaptism went back to its more pacifistic role. A new generation came about in the Anabaptists that still wanted to keep to the ideals of living according to how early Christians lived in the New Testament. The principal leader of this new generation, probably the most influential leader in the history of the Anabaptist movement, was a Dutch priest by the name of Menno Simons. Menno Simons was a Dutch priest who embraced Anabaptism, the Anabaptist movement. And he began to teach. And he believed very strongly in also pacifism. And adult baptism, and foot washing. As signs of faith. He became very influential, and he had a group of followers who became known as Mennonites. And the Mennonites spread to the New World, spread really around the world. It's the strongest group of descendants from the Anabaptist movement. And from them branched another group, Amish. Yep. The main offering of this group, which is reflected in other denominations but not to the extreme, separation of church from society. This is nothing new. There's always been that tension throughout the history of the church, there was always that tension between how much should we as Christians be part of this world that is so materialistic, so sinful, so all those things. And we have still, outside of these groups, within even more mainstream Christian theology or Christian denominations, you still have that point of view. How much should we take part in society? How much should we be part of it or be against it? And that is a question that I think most Christians have to wrestle with. How much in society do we accept? Or where does our Christian faith call us to stand up against it? And where do we draw that line? And that's an individual decision. But it also, a lot of times, helps us delineate between denominations about how far. It's one of the questions we can use to separate denominations from one another. So there's a lot of different ways we can do it, but this is one of the ways. And in one of the churches that comes later, the German Evangelical Synod, there's two brothers that are their leading theologians, the Niebuhr brothers, Reinhold and H. Richard, who were very instrumental in that denomination. And H. Richard wrote a book called Christ and Culture, in which he presents different options: Christ against culture, Christ above culture, Christ within culture. It's a good book. Anabaptism is important because it shows the changes that are going on within the world at that time. This is a very interesting time, that late 15th and mostly 16th century. There's a lot of changes going on, and there's a lot of ideas that are being explored. Sometimes peacefully, a lot of times not so peacefully. Yes.
Just to be clear, am I correct in thinking that Martin Luther didn't spring full-blown onto the reform scene by himself, that these other ideas were kind of in the air, so to speak?
Yeah.
So he wasn't
especially when you're talking about Luther and Zwingli, because Luther and Zwingli were very much Well, I mean, they were born 2 months apart. So they were very much kind of compatriots. They were doing the same things, but in slightly different places. But I would say the Anabaptist movement was probably a reaction to Luther and Zwingli. Probably, since it was starting more in Switzerland, probably more Zwingli than Luther.
I just want to point out, too, as a former fundamentalist Baptist for many years, that the number one tenet to them was being saved. And it was, if you believe that any works at all would get you to heaven, you were not saved. It was totally by Jesus. And the baptism by immersion was just a sign. It wasn't to get you to heaven. It was just a sign to the rest of the church. And so that was what it was at that church anyway.
Right, and that's a good point. But what you'll see in that point of view is salvation by faith alone. That's very Lutheran, right? So that's a descendant from Luther. The adult baptism part comes down from the Anabaptists. Interesting enough, the Anabaptists did not, early on when they first were started, did not insist on baptism by immersion. They baptized, and actually Menno Simons baptized by just pouring water over the head. It wasn't until later on that they insisted on immersion. What they believed was in the rite of baptism. They didn't care how it was done, just that it was done as an adult rather than as an infant, because if it was done as an infant, it didn't count. So now we get to the more complicated of the Reform movements, and that is Reformation in Great Britain. I mentioned to Rich before we started, and as you'll see when we get into talking about the establishment of the Church of England, the most dangerous thing for a woman's health or life during this time in England was being married to King Henry VIII. There were two houses that were essentially at war with one another. One was the House of Tudor, and the other was the House of Stuart. Tudor was in England, Stuart was in Scotland. And they battled back and forth for rule of the island. Mostly Tudor won, but there was a little bit of spate of the other. It began with Henry the Seventh. And at this time, during the 16th century, there was two basic power structures. England was allied with Spain, and Scotland was allied with France. And so King Henry VII, in order to cement the alliance with Spain, offered the hand of his son, Edward, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, who was the niece, I believe, of Queen Isabella of Spain. So they married. But the problem is that Arthur died shortly after. So Henry VII said, well, no problem. She'll just marry Arthur's younger brother, my son Henry. This wasn't allowed in the Catholic Church. You're not supposed to marry your brother. The widow of one's brother is not supposed to marry the brother. But the Pope said, we'll let it go. We'll let it happen. The report was that King Henry VIII, a marriage of King Henry VIII and Catherine was kind of doomed from the start. They didn't really care much for each other. But they cared for each other enough to have a child, Mary. But Catherine could not have a male heir. So, King Henry VIII wanted to believe that the rightful heir to him should be a male. And so he wanted to have the marriage annulled. Now, that wasn't a strange thing to do. It happened fairly often. The problem is that the Pope, Clement, the seventh, was afraid of Charles the fifth, who was the cousin of Catherine. Charles the seventh was, or no, Charles the fifth, sorry. Was the nephew of Queen Isabella. I guess Catherine was Queen Isabella's daughter. And so he had carried some weight, and so he had a lot of power, so the Pope was afraid of him. So the Pope says, can't go along with this annulment. Sorry, can't do it. There was a scholar at the time who was a friend of King Henry VIII by the name of Thomas Cranmer, who said, well, you know, if you look back into the doctrines of the church, you know, you can find a theological reason for it. You can make it work. So King Henry VIII his first idea was that he had a illegitimate son. And he thought, well, I'll just name my illegitimate son the heir. Well, that went over like a lead balloon. So that not working, he exerted the power on Rome, what he could. And the power he had was that he controlled the funds that went into Rome, the funds that England gave to Rome. And he threatened the Pope to restrain or retain those funds unless the Pope did something for him. What he had the Pope do was to name Thomas Cranmer the Archbishop of Canterbury, which gave him a certain amount of prestige. And through that appointment, the Parliament then decided to side with King Henry VIII, and they approved the marriage, or they gave sanction to the marriage, to the annulment from Catherine, and the marriage to Anne Boleyn, who he was unofficially married to already. And a side action, they also retained the funds. They stopped giving the funds to Rome. So, essentially, the Parliament broke with Rome rather than King Henry VIII breaking with Rome. But they were following King Henry VIII's encouragement. In fact, they went so far as saying that not only was King Henry VIII right to separate from Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn, and was the leader of the church, but if you disagreed with any of King Henry VIII's pronouncements, you're a heretic and a seditionist, and you were to be put to death. One of the people to disagree with all this, one influential person, who was actually at one time a pretty good friend of King Henry VIII's, was Sir Thomas More. And he had a problem with the annulment. But that wasn't his major problem. The major problem was that with the pronouncement that if you disagreed with King Henry VIII, you're a heretic, because he says a civil person cannot be the leader of the church. So, Thomas More was arrested, put in the Tower of London, and then beheaded. So, Anne Boleyn was King Henry VIII's second wife. Problem was that she couldn't produce a male heir either. So, King Henry VIII declared her an adulteress and had her beheaded. And he married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour gave him a male heir, Edward keeping track of all the numbers here is always the 6th. She was fortunate of King Henry's wives. She died of natural causes. She was not executed. But when she died, he married again. This time, he married Anne of Cleves. This was strictly a political marriage because he thought by marrying her, considering her heritage, where she was and everything, he might curry favor with the German Lutherans. Didn't work. They still sided with France. So, since that didn't work, Anne of Cleves was declared an adulteress and beheaded. So then he married Catherine of Howard. Catherine of Howard was very conservative. And she actually wanted to repair some of the breach between the England. No. The Church of England and the Catholics. And she was successful for a time, but she also didn't provide any male sons. So she was divorced and beheaded. So then he married Catherine Parr, who was his last wife. See what I mean by the most dangerous thing that you could be, the dangerous place you could be is be a wife of King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII died, and his son was declared his successor, Edward VI. But Edward was a very sickly child, and he only lived to be 6 years old. So, when he was alive, he was under the care of a regent, the Duke of Somerset. Now, the reason why this is important is actually during this regency, it was when the Church of England got really firmly established. There's some work that Thomas Cranmer got some work done. The Book of Common Prayer first edition came out. Today, even today, Anglicans or the Episcopal Church follow the Book of Common Prayer for their worship services. So this was established. Thomas Cranmer established the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. What was interesting about this edition of the Common Prayer is that when it approached communion, it had words about it that it was a memorial rite. It was a rite of memoriam. We do this in remembrance of me. Very Zwinglian understanding of the Eucharist. So that was the influence of the Reformed movement rather than Lutheranism on the English Protestant movement. When Edward VI died, the line of succession fell to Henry VIII's only other legitimate child. Mary of Tudor, the child of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Now, what do you think religiously Mary Tudor would feel sympathy towards? Catholics. Her mother was Spanish Catholic, and not only that, but since King Henry VIII, through that special annulment thing, got the annulment, that annulment made her illegitimate. So she wanted to make England Catholic again in order to make her legitimate. Also, she had some hard feelings against the Protestants. Naturally. And so she instituted, after she took power, some very strict restrictions upon Protestants, to the point of persecution, to the point of burning some 300 Protestants and exiling countless others, to the point that she, in history, was referred to as Bloody Mary. So she ruled with an iron fist. When she died, her half-sister took over. Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth returned it to Protestantism. Why, do you think? Because if the marriage had not been annulled and Mary was legitimate, what did that make Elizabeth? Illegitimate. So in order to become legitimate, the Church of England had to be Protestant. And during her reign, the Church of England flourished, along with some other things, including the birth of Shakespearean literature. But there is another. Elizabeth, quite frankly, did not care about denominational matters that much. She was much more political than that. She wanted just to kind of keep an even keel. So even though she was Protestant, she made overtures and tried to make the Catholics feel, she did not persecute the Catholics, she tried to make them feel welcome. And also, to show that she was kind of her personality, there was another reflection. Another edition of the Book of Common Prayer came out. And, let's see if I can find it. Let's see. Here it is. The new book combined two different formulas that early versions ordered ministers to use in the distribution of the bread during the Eucharist. The new text now read as follows. The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. Did you notice something in that? Both understandings of the Eucharist was there. It was a double understanding of the Eucharist. It was both a memorial and it was eating the body of Christ. Both the symbolism and the memorialism were present. And it was kind of the nature of Elizabeth's reign to kind of play that middle, right? What also happened during this explosion was that Thomas Cranmer also ordered that the Bible be translated from Latin into English, which was a major boon for the Protestant church. So, that is the church history of the Reformation in England. Now, there was, during Elizabeth's reign, some push that from the Catholic circles that she be deposed and that another queen be named in her place, Mary Stuart, Scotland. Mary Stuart was born to, let's see, this is how this works. James the Fourth of Scotland married Margaret Tudor, who is the daughter of King Henry VII, or sister to King Henry VIII. Now, James IV, they had a son, and when James IV passed, James V, King Henry VIII, offered his daughter, Mary Tudor, to marry James V. But Scotland rejected that because they wanted to keep their alliance with France rather than England. So when James V died, his daughter was Mary Stuart, but she was just an infant. So there was a battle, a power battle, over what should happen to Mary Stuart. King Henry VIII stepped in again, said, well, you know, we can have, well, it wasn't King Henry VIII. There's a number of Catholics, the circles in England, said, well, she can become Queen of England under Regency instead of Elizabeth. But the Protestants, no. I'm trying to think out how this went. Anyway, one group wanted her to go over to England, and one group wanted to go to France. I think it was the Catholics wanted to go to France. And so even though there was Protestants in Scotland, the power in Scotland was with the Catholic Church. But then the Protestants took over St. Andrews. They just took over the church and declared, as armed rebellion. And into that fray came a theologian, firebrand, by the name of John Knox. Now, John Knox was a scholar. He had studied theology. He had been a priest. And a couple of the noblemen who planned this rebellion at St. Andrews to take it over, they had two sons, and he was tutoring those sons, and they wanted the noblemen wanted their sons brought to St. Andrews. So he thought, well, I'll just deliver the boys and be on my way. Well, he delivered the boys, but then he was convinced, because he was such a powerful orator and such a powerful theologian, he couldn't help himself, but he had to take over and become the spokesperson for Protestantism in Scotland. He didn't really want the job, but somebody had to do it, and so he became the leading spokesperson of Protestantism in Scotland. Well, the Catholics wanted Mary Stuart to return from France to Scotland. Problem is that when she was in France, she married the heir to the throne of France. So they named her Queen of Scotland in absentia. Right? She was a titular leader of Scotland and consort to the ruler of France. Well, her husband dies. And she was convinced to return to Scotland. And she was made queen. And she restored the Catholic Church. But during all this time, the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant movement continued to gain strength in Scotland, and they had three pillars. It was the Book of Discipline, Book of Common Prayer, and the Scots Confession. Pretty powerful under the leadership of John Knox. John Knox was put into exile in England. His heart still remained in Scotland. Once a Scot, always a Scot. So, Mary Stuart kind of led to her own demise here, in that she tried to be too clever by half. Let's see how this works. There was a leader by name of Malloy who wanted her to go in a certain direction, but she married a cousin who was a Duke of Fonboy. And in order to overcome Malloy, they enlisted the heir of Borester, who was a military person. And she and Mary discovered that this Duke was kind of feckless, and it didn't work out. So she left him and married him, which incurred the wrath of all the people of this, and she was deposed as queen, and she was sent to live with her half-aunt, I think, Elizabeth. And she spent the rest of her life in the palace, Windsor Palace, with Queen Elizabeth. Now, legend has it that Mary Stuart was kept in chains in prison, but the actual history says that Elizabeth, for the most part, at least during the early part, was very respectful of Mary, allowed her to have her own attendants, told everyone to treat her like the queen because she had been a queen, and to treat her like a queen. That lasted until some of the followers of hers started attacking Protestants. And that became too much of a threat and too much discord. So Elizabeth, much to her own dismay, obviously had her quietly executed. But, story has it, she walked to the guillotine with great dignity. Meanwhile, Protestantism was firmly entrenched in Scotland through the powerful influence of John Knox, who did not endear himself to any of the queens, be it Mary Stuart, obviously, but also to Mary Tudor and Elizabeth, because when he was in exile, he wrote a polemic saying, decrying the evils of women being in any sort of ruling power, that it was evil and destructive to the world. And Elizabeth, even though she had sympathies for the Protestant religion, really didn't care for that. But without John Knox, you would not have Protestantism in Scotland. And that Protestantism, the nature of that particular strain of Protestantism tended to be much more Calvinistic than anything else. So the denomination that probably had the firmest hold in Scotland was the Presbyterian Church. Such is the sordid history of Protestantism in Great Britain. More than you probably wanted to know, right? But if it wasn't for Anglicanism, if it wasn't for King Henry VIII, you wouldn't have the Church of England, the Anglican Church. If you didn't have the Anglican Church, then you wouldn't have the people who try to purify that church. You wouldn't have the Puritans. And if you didn't have the Puritans, you wouldn't have the Congregational Church. That's next. Actually, next is probably going to be the evangelical and reformed traditions of the UCC. The Evangelical Synod and the Reformed Church of America. And, yeah. You know, I have a limited amount of time here. So I'm mostly focusing on the direct history, lineage of our denomination. And the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or that Reformation that the Catholic Church went through in response, how the Catholic Church actually reformed itself in response to the Reformation. I mean, the first response was just strict counter to it, calling them all heretics, saying that they're all wrong. But then they began to be more self-reflective and making some changes, not the least of which was the Jesuits. Though that history is important, it doesn't really directly affect us. If it does, try to bring it in. Any questions?
Got a good meatloaf recipe?
You use crackers. And I don't put ketchup on meatloaf. I can't stand, that ketchup sauce. My mom never, my grandmother Kirkpatrick never did it. My mother never did it. So I never grew up with it, and I go and order it in a restaurant, and they put that doggone stuff on it every time. I'm going, why do you have to do that? That has nothing to do with the history of UCC. I don't put tomatoes in them. Just eggs and crackers and seasoning.
Does the Catholic getting back on, since we're just
Yeah, getting back on track after you took us away.
that's all right. You're welcome. Anyway, does the Catholic Bible still include the books of the Apocrypha?
Yes. He asks the question, does the Catholic Bible still use the books of the Apocrypha? Yes, they do. But that's a completely different subject, how the Bible came to be, and the long history of how the Bible, the canon we know as the Holy Scriptures came to be is a whole nother question. And why the Protestant version has less books than the Catholic version. No, the next one I have already committed to. Book of Revelation. Diane Leitenberg has committed me to it. So. Okay. Any other questions for the good of the public? Okay, I guess you had enough of me, so.